بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأصلي وأسلم على مبعوث رحمة للعالمين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So we continue بإذن ta'ala with now our 7th lesson, going through this tremendous treatise of the Mujaddid Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah ta'ala, which he titled Nawaqidul Islam, the nullifiers of al-Islam. And walillah alhamd, we had reached the 6th nullifier, and that is when he said rahimahullah ta'ala, من استهزأ بشيء من دين الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم أو ثوابه أو عقابه كفر. والدليل قوله تعالى قل أبي الله وآياته ورسوله كنتم تستهزئون لا تعتذروا قد كفرتم بعد إيمانكم. That is when he said rahimahullah ta'ala that whoever mocks any aspect of the religion of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or its reward or its punishment, kafar, then he is disbelieved. And the evidence is his statement tabaraka wa ta'ala, say, is it Allah and his ayat and his signs and his messenger that you were mocking? La ta'tadiru, do not make any excuses. قَدْ كَفَرْتُمْ بَعْدَ إِيمَانِكُمْ, for you have disbelieved after having iman. And Shaykh Salih Fawzan hafidhahullah ta'ala, he goes on to explain this nullifier, and he says هَذَا بَابٌ عَظِيمٌ, this is a tremendous chapter. وَالَّذِي قَبْلَهُ, and he mentions that which is before it is whoever dislikes or detests something from that which the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam came with. And then he says, حفظ ta'ala, وَالْبُغْضُ وَالْكِرَاهَ مِنْ أَعْمَالِ الْقُلُوبِ, that the detesting and disliking is from the actions of the heart. So here we find the difference between the two chapters. To detest something or dislike something is from the actions of the heart. However, to mock something, al-istihza min aqwal al-lisan, to mock something is from the statements of the tongue. So there's a difference between the two chapters. That one of them is in relation to the actions of the heart, and the other one is in relation to the statements of the tongue. Then he says, حفظ الله تعالى, وهذه الآية الكريمة جاء في سبب نزولها. He goes on to mention, حفظ الله تعالى, the reason as to why this ayah was revealed. And this, ya ikhwan, is extremely important. We need to pay attention to this story, because no doubt there are tremendous benefits, which we will come back to and discuss later on bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But as for the reason as to why this ayah was revealed, was because a group from amongst the Muslims, and they were combatants alongside the Prophet ﷺ in the Ghazwa of Tabuk, in the Battle of Tabuk, فَاجْتَمَعُوا فِي مَجْلِسٍ, so they gathered together in a sitting. فَتَكَلَّمَ وَاحِدٌ مِّنْهُمْ, and one from amongst them, he spoke out and he said, مَا رَأَيْنَا مِثْلَ قُرَّائِنَا هَؤُلَاء, that we have not seen the likes of our reciters. And we're going to mention the definition of the word reciters later on. But he said, we have not seen the likes of these reciters of ours. أَرْغَبُ بُطُونًا, that they are the most hungriest in their stomachs. And they are the most lying, those who lie the most with their tongues. And they are the most cowardice in battle. And they intended by this statement, قُرَّائِنَا يَعْنُونَ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ وَأَصْحَابِهِ, that they intended by way of it the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his companions. So he said that look at the Messenger of Allah and his companions, that they are the hungriest of the people, in relation to their stomachs and filling their bellies, and they are the most lying of the people, and the most cowardice in battle. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. And then within that sitting was a shab min al-Ansar, was a youth from the Ansar, and it said that his name is Auf bin Malik. Auf bin Malik. So Auf bin Malik, he was amongst this group of people who were saying this stuff, or in that gathering where this one individual said these statements. And he stood up and he said to the man who had said them, كذبت, that you have lied. لكنك منافق, but you are a munafiq. You are a hypocrite. And I'm going to inform the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So Auf bin Malik, that he went to inform the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam about what this man had said. That he went to go and inform him about what this man had said. And he found that before he could get to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the revelation had already been sent down by Allah Azza wa Jal. And that revelation was these ayat. قُلْ أَبِاللَّهِ وَآيَاتِهِ وَرَسُولِهِ كُنْتُمْ تَسْتَهْزِئُونَ. Say, was it Allah and His signs and His messenger that you were mocking? لَا تَعْتَذِرُوا. Do not make any excuses. قَدْ كَفَرْتُمْ بَعْدَ إِيمَانِكُمْ. Because you have disbelieved after having iman. And he also found that this man who had said these statements, that he came to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he was trying to make excuses to him. And he said, Ya Rasulullah, إِنَّمَا كُنَّا نَخُوضُ وَنَلْعَبُ. O Messenger of Allah, we were merely just gesturing and joking about. We were just talking to each other and just joking about. We didn't intend these statements and this mockery. And the Messenger of Allah ﷺ was extremely angry, to the extent that he would not look towards the man, and he would only recite to him these verses. He would only recite to him these verses. Say, was it Allah and His signs and His messenger that you are mocking? Do not make any excuses, for you have disbelieved after having iman. So this story, ya ikhwan, that this is the reason as to why these ayat were revealed. And likewise it serves as a proof for this nullifier, that anyone who mocks an aspect from the religion of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or from its reward or its punishment, then he is disbelieved. And then he brings this proof. And who can tell me, ya ikhwan, that what is the proof from this ayah? What is the main shahid here in this ayah? How is this ayah a proof that a person has nullified their Islam? Where is it found within the ayah? Who can highlight it to me? Explicitly.
So where it says you have disbelieved after having...
نعم حسنت قد كفرتم بعد إيمانكم. That you have disbelieved. So Allah Azza wa Jal has declared them as disbelieving. Due to what? Due to their mocking. Due to the istihza. So we find that this is the proof for this naqid, for this nullifier. That he said subhanahu wa ta'ala قَدْ كَفَرْتُمْ بَعْدَ إِيمَانِكُمْ. And Shaykh Salih Fawzan حفظه ta'ala, he mentions هذا دليل على أنهم كانوا مؤمنين. That this is an evidence that they were believers. And this is also the proof here. This is also the shahid here. That this was an evidence that they were upon iman. وَلَيْسُوا مُنَافِقِينَ. That they were not munafiqeen. They were not hypocrites. But rather they were upon iman. And why is this important to mention, ya ikhwan? Why do we make this distinction? Because if they were hypocrites, then aslan they did not believe. So therefore that would not exit them from Islam, because they had not entered into Islam aslan, because they are hypocrites. The hypocrite is the one who disbelieves inwardly. Whereas he subhanahu wa ta'ala affirmed for them having iman, that they have disbelieved after having iman. So this is an important point to make mention here, that they were not munafiqeen, but rather they were mu'mineen, that they were believers. Allah Azza wa Jalla affirmed for them iman. And likewise he said subhanahu wa ta'ala in another ayah, that he said tabarak wa ta'ala in relation to the munafiqeen. We need to notice the difference here now. So this first ayah is in relation to whom, ya ikhwan? Those who were upon iman and then they disbelieved. Now we have another ayah that is in relation to those who are upon nifaq, those who are upon hypocrisy. The Allah Azza wa Jal said, وَلَقَدْ قَالُوا كَلِمَةَ الْكُفْرِ وَكَفَرُوا بَعْدَ إِسْلَامِهِمْ وَكَفَرُوا بَعْدَ إِسْلَامِهِمْ. Notice the difference in the words here. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in relation to the munafiqeen, that they had said a statement of disbelief, and they have disbelieved after their Islam. They have disbelieved after their Islam, not their Iman. And there's a huge difference here. As we know, ya ikhwan, that these are from those words that when they are coupled together, when Iman and Islam are mentioned in the same sentence, that they have a different meaning. They have a different meaning. But when they are mentioned separately, then generally they mean the same thing. And this is a principle that we go by. So here Allah Azza wa Jal mentioned the word Islam. Why? Because the meaning of Islam is إعلان الدخول في الإسلام, meaning that a person announces that they have entered into Islam, even if they are not truthful in their heart, even if they are not sincere in their heart. However, they affirm and they announce that they have entered into Islam. So even if they are not صادق في قلبي, even if they are not truthful in their heart, فقد يكون كافرا في الباطن, that perhaps a person can be a disbeliever inwardly. وإن كان يظهر الإسلام, even if he displays and makes apparent his Islam. However, a person cannot be a believer. Person cannot be a believer outwardly and have hypocrisy internally. It can never be the case. Like the believer is the one who outwardly shows and makes apparent his faith, and inwardly likewise affirms his faith. So they cannot be coupled and combined. This is an important point here, ya ikhwan. Again, to emphasize the fact that Allah Azza wa Jal said that they had disbelieved after their Iman, because this proves that they were upon Iman. And therefore that mockery that they did, that was the thing that had exited them from their Iman and taken them out of the fold of Al-Islam. واضح? Is that clear? طيب. Then he mentions, Hafidhullah Ta'ala, that this ayah تدل على أمور عظيمة. That this ayah, that it highlights to us and shows to us some extremely important affairs. We're going to go through them one by one, بإذن. The first affair that he mentions, أنه يجب احترام وتعظيم الله. There is a must, is an obligation that a person honors and exalts Allah Azza wa Jal. وأن من تنقص الله فإنه يكفر. And the one who belittles Allah Azza wa Jal, then he is disbelieved. The one who has belittled Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then he is disbelieved. For example, the statements of the Jews. We find many examples throughout the Quran. مثل ما قالت اليهود يد الله مغلولة. When the Jews said that the hand of Allah is tied, and meaning that he is tight-fisted, وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. And he said subhanahu wa ta'ala, غُلَّتْ أَيْدِيهِمْ وَلُعِنُوا بِمَا قَالُوا. Rather, their hands are tied. They are tight-fisted. And they are cursed for that which they have said. So no doubt this is belittling Allah Azza wa Jal. And this in essence is disbelief. And likewise when they said, when Bani Israel said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ فَقِيرٌ وَنَحْنُ أَغْنِيَاءٌ. That Allah is the one who is in need, and we are the ones who are not in need. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. And likewise the statement of the Christians when they said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ هُوَ الْمَسِيحُ ابْنُ مَرْيَمَ. Allah is the Masih, the Messiah, the son of Maryam. No doubt this is belittling Allah Azza wa Jal. So that's the first affair. There's an obligation to honor and to exalt Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second affair that he mentions, Hafidhullah, أن تنقص الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم كفر أيضا. The belittling the messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم is also kufr, is also disbelief. A person belittles the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam. And Allah Azza wa Jal, that He has commanded أمر بتعظيم الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم وتوقيره واحترامه. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He has commanded that we have respect and we honor the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم. As He said subhanahu wa ta'ala, يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تقدموا بين يدي الله ورسوله واتقوا الله إن الله سميع عليم. As He said subhanahu wa ta'ala, oh you believe, do not put yourselves forward before Allah Azza wa Jal and His Messenger, and fear Allah, indeed Allah is all hearing and all knowing. Then He said subhanahu wa ta'ala, يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا ترفعوا أصواتكم فوق صوت النبي ولا تجهروا له بالقول كجهر بعضكم لبعض أن تحبط أعمالكم وأنتم لا تشعرون. He said subhanahu wa ta'ala, oh you believe, do not raise your voices above the voice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And why is this the case, ya ikhwan? Why is it the case that is a prohibition for a person to raise his voice above the voice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? No, because he's not like any other person. And this is no doubt a sign of disrespect and not honoring him and not giving him his right, alayhi salatu wasalam. So He said subhanahu wa ta'ala, oh you believe, do not raise your voices above the voice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and do not speak loudly to him. Just how you speak to one another, that your deeds may become null and void whilst you are unaware. That your deeds may become null and void whilst you are unaware and oblivious. And subhanAllah ya ikhwan, look at the Sahaba. Look at the companions of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That we find Shaykh Ali Nasir Faqihi, Hafidullah Ta'ala, that he always mentions, whenever talking about this ayah, that he mentions the story of the great Sahabi Thabit bin Qais radiallahu ta'ala an, that he was someone who was loud spoken. He was someone who was naturally, and he had a loud voice. So when this ayah was revealed, he thought that it was in relation to him. He was absent for a while. We find that he was absent for a while, and the Prophet ﷺ began to inquire about him. Where is he? We haven't seen him. So some of the companions that they went to go and search for him, and they found him in his house crying. They found him in his house crying. So they come to him, they said, what is the matter with you? So he mentioned to them this. He said that I am one who raises my voice above the voice of the Prophet ﷺ, so therefore my actions are null and void. He thought these actions were now null and void, because he was someone who used to naturally speak with a raised voice. That this is the way of the companion. This is the understanding, that fear of Allah Azza wa Jal. That they never felt safe. That upon hearing this, that he thought that this ayah was revealed in relation to him, and that his actions are now null and void, because he was one who used to speak loudly. Even though unintentionally, he never used to purposely raise his voice above the Prophet ﷺ in order to disrespect him. However, he was someone who was naturally loud spoken. Na'am. And then he mentions as well, Habibullah Ta'ala, statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, لا تجعلوا دعاء الرسول بينكم كدعاء بعضكم بعضا. Do not make the calling out to the Prophet ﷺ just how you call out to one another. You do not address him and call out to him how you call out and address one another. And then he mentions, Habibullah Ta'ala, that this here, that we take from this, that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is important benefit, ينادي بالرسالة, or ينادى بالرسالة, that he is to be called out with his title of messengership. So when they would call out to him, they say, Ya Rasulullah, Ya Nabi Allah. They would address him and say, O Messenger of Allah, O Prophet of Allah. This is how we find the adab and the manners that the companions had when addressing him. So we find mentioned in many ahadith that they would address him and say, Ya Rasulullah, O Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. وَلَا يُقَالُ يَا مُحَمَّدْ بِاسْمِهِ. And he's not called out with the saying of, O Muhammad, mentioning his name. يعني مجرد, just his name alone. وإنما يخاطب بالرسالة والنبوة تعظيما له صلى الله عليه وسلم. But rather he's addressed with his status of messengership and prophethood out of respect and honoring him عليه الصلاة والسلام. And this is why we find that Allah Azza wa Jal, that He likewise addresses him throughout the Quran with his title of messengership and prophethood. He says, Ya ayyuha rasul, Ya ayyuha nabi. And He does not mention his name, and this is an important point to pay attention to here, because we do find in the Quran that there are some ayat that Allah Azza wa Jal mentions his name. So a person may ask, what is the case in relation to this then? We find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned his name. However, there's a difference between the two. Why? Because we find that when Allah Azza wa Jal mentions his name, it is fi maqam al-ikhbar. It is that Allah Azza wa Jal is informing about him. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is informing about him. La fi maqam al-nida. It is not when Allah Azza wa Jal is addressing him directly and commanding him. So when He mentions his name subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout the Quran, is when He is informing about him. For example, we find many places throughout the Quran, for example, مَا كَانَ مُحَمَّدٌ أَبَا أَحَدٍ مِّن رِجَالِكُمْ. That Muhammad is not the father of one of your men. He mentions subhanahu wa ta'ala, he mentions his name, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, but this is not an address. This is not an address. Rather, he is informing about him. However, when he addresses him subhanahu wa ta'ala, he addresses him with his title of messengership and prophethood. This is a nice little detail to pay attention to. طيب, the third affair, أن الواجب نحو القرآن احترامه. So likewise, what is an obligation in relation to the Quran is to honor it and respect it. Why? Because it's the speech of Allah Azza wa Jal. It's the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the speech of Allah Azza wa Jal is what, ya ikhwan? Is an attribute from the attributes of Allah Azza wa Jal. So therefore, there's a must and an obligation that a person respects the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he honors it. Like the fourth affair, that likewise it's an obligation that a person honors and respects the deen of al-Islam, the religion of Islam, وَعَدَمْ تَنَقُّصِهِ, and that he does not belittle it. He does not belittle the religion of Allah tabarak wa ta'ala. Why? Because it's the religion of Allah Azza wa Jal wa Shar'u, and His legislation. So it's not permissible for anyone that he belittles and tries to take away from the deen of Allah Azza wa Jal, or he speaks with any speech that is tantamount to mocking and insulting the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The fifth affair, ya ikhwan, is that it is an obligation, likewise, that a person respects and honors the sunnah of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. An obligation that a person honors the sunnah of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Why? Because it's the speech of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and his speech is what, ya ikhwan? Is revelation, is wahi from Allah Azza wa Jal. وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. That he does not speak from his own desires, but rather it is revelation that is revealed to him. So they must that a person that he respects and honors the sunnah of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. The sixth affair, ya ikhwan, the sixth affair is that it is an obligation to honor and to respect the ulama of al-Islam, the scholars of Islam. An obligation to honor and respect the scholars of al-Islam. Why? Because they are warathatul anbiya. They are the inheritors of the prophets. Scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. So it's not permissible that a person belittles them and mocks them. And he says, Hafidullah Ta'ala, he mentions the ayah where he says, Wallah rafa'a min sha'nihim wa a'la min makanihim, that Allah Azza wa Jal has raised their affair and raised their station. Because Allah Azza wa Jal said, يَرْفَعِ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنْكُمْ وَالَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمَ دَرَجَاتٍ. That Allah raises those who believe from among you and those who have been given knowledge, darajat, many levels. Then he says, حفظ الله تعالى, فَهَؤُلَاء وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ وَقَعُوا فِي هَذِهِ الْجَرِيمَةِ. So now going back to the story, ya ikhwan, when we mentioned the story of why the ayah was revealed. Because we find that within the story, that those people in the gathering, that they had fallen into this exact crime. They had fallen into this exact crime. Why, ya ikhwan? Who were they mocking? The companions. Who were the ulama of that time? They were no doubt the scholars of that time. So not only were they mocking and belittling the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, but they were also mocking and belittling the companions. Why? Because they used the word مَا رَأَيْنَا مِثْلَ قُرَّائِنَا, that we have not seen the likes of our reciters, in its plural form, meaning the Messenger of Allah ﷺ and those who are with him. And this word qurra, ya ikhwan, as we said that we will mention, that here it refers to the ulama. It refers to the scholars. That when qurra was used from before the time of the Salaf, that we find that it would refer to those who have ilm, those are ulama. As he says, حفظ الله تعالى, لأنه كان في ذاك الوقت الذي يقرأ القرآن يكون عالما. Because at that time, those who were reciters of the Quran, that they were also ulama. They were scholars. أما في زمان المتأخر فقد يكون القارئ لا يفهم شيئا من معاني القرآن. As for in the later times, then perhaps the one who is a reciter of the Quran, he understands absolutely nothing from the meanings of the Quran. And it's an important point to pay attention to nowadays, ya ikhwan, because there are many. There are many reciters. As he mentions here, حفظ الله تعالى, أو ولا يفقه وإنما يجيد القراءة فقط. That perhaps they don't even have any understanding, but rather they only have, mashallah, that beautiful and that good recitation. But perhaps they have no understanding. They don't understand anything from the meanings of that which they are reciting. As we know, ya ikhwan, that from one of the signs of the last hour, or the end of times, يكثر القراء ويقل الفقهاء, that the reciters will become plentiful and the ulama, the scholars and the jurists, they will become few. This is from one of the signs of the hour, that the reciters will be plentiful. However, the scholars and those who have actual understanding of the deen of Allah Azza wa Jal, that they will be very few in number. And that's what we find our times. There are many reciters. And sadly, many of the people mistake them for ulama. Many of the people take them as literal scholars. And people understand the religion of Allah Azza wa Jal. While sadly we find them according to other than the book of Allah Azza wa Jal and the sunnah of His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. نسأل الله السلامة والعافية. طيب, then he says, حفظ الله تعالى, ويؤخذ من هذا, what is taken from this is that the one who belittles the ulama من أجل علمهم, the one who belittles the scholars due to their knowledge. If a person belittles the scholars due to that which they have by way of their ilm, by way of their knowledge, في أي وقت, in any time, at any given time, that he enters into the general meaning of this ayah. So if a person mocks the scholars due to their knowledge, and due to them calling to the book of Allah Azza wa Jal and the sunnah of His Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, then they have entered into this general meaning of the ayah. Meaning that they are now mocking the religion of Allah Azza wa Jal. Why? Because we find, going back to the story, again, that they were mocking their ulama. They were mocking the companions who were their ulama and their scholars at the time. So the ulama, as he said, حَبِدَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى لَهُمْ إِحْتِرَامُهُمْ وَإِجْلَالُهُم, that they have their honor, and they have to be honored and respected. لِأَنَّهُمْ يَحْمِلُونَ كِتَابَ اللَّهِ وَسُنَّةَ رَسُولِهِ صلى الله عليه وسلم. Why? Because they are the ones who carry and convey the book of Allah Azza wa Jal and the sunnah of His Messenger صلى الله عليه وسلم, and they are the ones who carry and convey this knowledge to the people. And likewise we find, ya ikhwan, the statement of Imam Ahmad in relation to this affair of belittling and mocking the ulama and backbiting them. He said, rahimahullah ta'ala, لحوم العلماء مسمومة. لحوم العلماء مسمومة. That the flesh of the scholars is poisoned. It is poisoned flesh. من شمها مرض. Whoever smells it becomes ill. Whoever smells it becomes ill. وَمَنْ أَكَلَهَا مَاتٍ. And whoever eats it dies. Whoever eats from that flesh and he backbites them, belittles them, then he dies. And the one who smells it, the one who perhaps he hasn't spoken directly about them, however he is in those gatherings where the ulama are being mocked and spoken about, so he's indirectly participating, as we're going to find later on in relation to this story likewise. So he was indirectly participating with them. That he becomes ill, he becomes poisoned. طيب, the seventh affair, ya ikhwan, احترام عموم المسلمين أفرادا وجماعات. To honor the general Muslims. A person honors and has respect for the general Muslims, both individually and as groups. The eighth affair that he says, حمد الله تعالى, and this is important here, من العجب أن الذي تكلم في المجلس واحد فالله عمم الحكم. That what is amazing about this is that the one who spoke in that gathering, if we go back to the story and the reason as to why the ayah was revealed, that the one who actually spoke and said these statements when he was mocking the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the companions, it was one individual. It was one man who said it. However, Allah Azza wa Jal, that He made the ruling general. He made the ruling general. He said, قُلْ أَبِاللَّهِ وَآيَاتِي وَرَسُولِي كُنْتُمْ تَسْتَهْزِئُونَ. Say, was it Allah and His signs and His messenger that you all were mocking in the plural form? Even though the one who was actually doing the mocking, ya ikhwan, was what? He was singular. He was wahid. He was one individual. However, Allah Azza wa Jal, that He generalized the ruling and made it applicable to all of them. فَنَسَبَ الْإِسْتِهْزَاءِ إِلَيْهِمْ جَمِيعًا. They attributed the act of mocking to all of them. And why is this the case, ya ikhwan? Who can tell me why is this the case? Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make the ruling general for all of them, even though it was only one individual who spoke? And they didn't? They didn't disagree. Yes, salam. Why did Allah Azza wa Jal make this ruling general? لأنهم لم ينكروا. Because they never made inkar. They never reprimanded him and rebuked him for that which he had said. So He subhanahu wa ta'ala made this ruling general for them. لأنهم لما سكتوا على المنكر صاروا شركاء مع فاعل المنكر. Because when they were silent, since they were silent upon the evil that took place, then they became all participants with the one who had actually committed the act of evil. It's a principle that we take from this. It is not permissible for a person to remain silent. It is not permissible for a person to remain silent when the deen of Allah Azza wa Jal is being mocked, or when the ulama are being mocked, when the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and the companions are being mocked. It is impermissible for a person to remain silent and to not reprimand those who are doing the mocking. And if you remain silent, then perhaps he is included in the ruling with them. Wallahu musta'an. And likewise, when we find in the story that the shab, that the youth who was the one who did reprimand them, he was the one that stood up and did reprimand them and went back to inform the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam about that which they had said. Buriya min al-itham, that he is now freed from that sin. He has made himself free from that sin. That he made it clear that he is not a participant in that despicable act. So he freed himself from that sin. So he is not included in that ruling. فدل على أن الذي لا ينكر سب الله أو سب الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم والصحابة أو سب الدين أو سب العلماء أنه يكون مثل الساب سواء بسواء. As he says, Habibullah Ta'ala, that this here is a clear proof that the one who does not make inkar and reprimand, the one who curses Allah, or curses and insults his Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, or the companions, or he curses and insults and belittles the deen, or he curses and insults the ulama, then he is the exact same as the one who is doing the slandering and the insulting and the cursing. Sawa'un bisawa. He is the exact same. He is equal to him. Then he says, Habibullah Ta'ala, that this ayah فيها عبر وأحكام عظيمة ينبغي للمسلم أن يتأملها ويتدبرها لئلا يقع في شيء مما حذرت منه or حذرت منه. That this ayah, within it are tremendous signs and lessons and rulings. There is a must that the Muslim, that he reflects and he contemplates over them, so that he does not fall into anything from that which the ayah warns of. وَهَذِهِ الْأُمُورِ كَثِيرَةٌ فِي النَّاسِ الْيَوْمِ. And we find that these affairs are widespread amongst the people today. That we find that many of the people, that they fall into these affairs, belittling and mocking the religion of Allah Azza wa Jal. فالاستهزاء بالدين والعلماء والاستهزاء بالسنة والقرآن كثير. That mocking and joking and playing about with the religion of Allah Azza wa Jal and with the scholars and belittling the Sunnah and the Quran, we find that it is plentiful in our times. Wallahu musta'an. And he mentions, Habibullah Ta'ala, that the ulama, that they mentioned that istihza, that mocking, is of two types. That mocking is of two types, or it can be done by two different ways, we could say. The mocking can be done in two different ways. The first one is that which is referred to as istihza'un sarih bil qawl, the explicit mocking that is done by way of statement. That a person explicitly and directly mocks by way of his statement. And the other one is istihza bil ishara, that a person mocks by way of gesturing, by way of gestures. For example, an example of that is that he moves his lips mockingly, and just as you do as a kid, that you're trying to imitate someone or annoy them, that he moves his lips mockingly. So for example, if the ulama is speaking and a person is there moving his lips, trying to imitate them and mock them, And this no doubt falls into istihza. It falls into mocking. Even though he hasn't done what, ya ikhwan? He hasn't said anything. He hasn't actually spoken or said anything. However, moving his lips is what? Is a gesture. That he is mocking them. Or making a mockery. Or for example, يَمُدُّ عَيْنَهُ إِسْتِهْزَاءً. And he moves his eyes in a way that is mockery. Or that he does any type of gesture that will give the impression that he's belittling and trying to mock. طيب. Then he says, حمد الله تعالى وعلى المسلم أن يتنبه لهذه الأمور ويتجنب الكلام السيء. So upon the Muslim is that he stays away and he avoids this evil speech. لا سيما الكلام في أمور الشرع وأهل الشرع والعلماء. Especially in relation to the affairs of the legislation and the affairs of the scholars. وأن يحفظ لسانه. And that he protects his tongue. He preserves his tongue. Like the ninth affair that he mentions, Hafidallah, is that within the ayah is a very important mas'ala. Is a very important affair. And that is that the one who mocks Allah Azza wa Jal, or mocks his Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, or mocks his book in the Quran, or the Sunnah of his Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, أنه يكفر, that he has disbelieved, سواء كان جادا أو حازنا أو مازحا, regardless of whether he was serious, regardless of whether he was actually serious in his mocking, and he did it intentionally, or whether he did it out of just amusement and playfulness and joking about. He is disbelieved regardless of whether he is serious or what, ya ikhwan, or did so jokingly and out of jest and playfulness. Why? لأن هذا الأمر ليس فيه مزح ولا هزل. Because this affair is serious. This affair is serious. There's no joking. There's no amusement in it. So it's not permissible that a person that he jokes about in this type of manner. So whoever insults Allah Azza wa Jal, or His Messenger, or the Quran, or the Sahaba, and those who follow them from the people of knowledge, فَإِنَّهُ يَنَالُهُ هَذَا الْوَعِيدَ الشَّدِيدِ. Then he will obtain this severe threat. He is under severe threat. وَلَوْ كَانَ مَازِحًا. Even if he is joking. And who can give me a proof for this, ya ikhwan? From the story that we mentioned. That's why I said at the beginning, pay attention to the story. This is very important. The man's excuse. Na'am, ahsant. That the man's excuse. That when he came to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what did he say to him? That we were merely joking. إِنَّا نَخُوضُ وَنَلْعَبُ. That we were just joking and gesturing and being boisterous and playing about. That's all we were doing. We were just amusing each other. That's all we were doing. So even still, with that being the excuse, that Allah Azza wa Jal has declared them as disbelievers. That excuse is not accepted. That is not a legitimate excuse. The fact that you were joking or did so in play and you were not serious in what you were saying, that is not enough of an excuse. That you still included under that same threat. Because Allah Azza wa Jal, He connected the ruling بمجرد الاستهزاء, with merely just the mockery itself. The ruling is associated and connected with the mockery itself. So the one who mocks Allah Azza wa Jal and His Messenger and His ayat, even if he was joking and was not serious in the affair, then this no doubt is tantamount to kufr billahi. Nasallahu salam wa afiyah. طيب. The 10th affair, ya ikhwan, the 10th affair, and again, a very extremely important point to make note of, that likewise this ayah proves that a person has fallen into disbelief, this ayah proves that a person has fallen into disbelief, وَلَوْ لَمْ يَعْلَمْ أَنَّ هَذَا كُفْرٌ, even if he does not know that that affair is kufr. That a person has fallen into disbelief, even if he does not know that mocking is kufr, is an act of kufr, that the ruling still applies to him. And again, what is the proof for this, Ya Ikhwan, from the story? The proof for this is that that they were not aware. They were not aware of the severity of that which they had said. They were not aware of the severity of it. And that's why the man, when he was reprimanded by who, Ya Ikhwan? By Auf bin Malik. No, that when they were reprimanded by Auf bin Malik, that the man, what did he do? He went immediately to, who did he go to? He went to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the man, the one who was mocking. Then he went straight to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not realizing the significance of what he had actually done. So he came to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he was putting forward his excuses. And he putting forward these excuses, not realizing the severity of the action. And the Prophet ﷺ, that he would not even look at him, he would not even look at the man, but rather he would just recite to him this ayah. So he mentions لأن هؤلاء ما علموا أن هذا كفر, that they did not know that this was an act of kufr. فهؤلاء كانوا أهل إيمان, that they were people of Iman, as we mentioned before, that they were people of Iman, and they did not know that this was an act of kufr. But Allah Azza wa Jal, He never excused them due to it. That's the shahid. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He never excused them due to the fact that they were doing it out of playfulness and jest, nor did He excuse them due to the fact that they did not know the ruling. And this is what we find, ya ikhwan, throughout the legislation of Allah Azza wa Jal. There are many examples of this. A person cannot say that he did not know the ruling, therefore it does not apply. The thief cannot say that I did not know the ruling, therefore the ruling does not apply to me. The zani cannot say I did not know the ruling, therefore the ruling does not apply to me. We find many evidences for this from the Sharh, from the legislation of Allah Azza wa Jal. So the shahid is what, ya ikhwan, that Allah Azza wa Jal, that He never excused them due to their mockery, yani in jest or play, and He never excused them due to the fact that they were ignorant, that they did not know. So that is not an excuse, and that is not applicable. So from that we take, ya ikhwan, that the one who mocks Allah Azza wa Jal, or His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or His religion, or His book, or the Sunnah of His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the ulama, by way of that which they have with them by way of ilm, that this, and the Sahaba is included in that as well, that this, no doubt, ya ikhwan, that the one who does so, regardless of whether he was doing it in jest or playfulness, regardless of whether or not he was ignorant of its ruling and the severe outcome and consequence, and that it is an act of kufr, that regardless of all of these things, that he has still fallen into this severe threat. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. Then he says, Hafidullah Ta'ala, to conclude, he says that this mas'ala is muhimmah, that it is extremely important, and that there is no difference between the one who is serious or the one who is hazil, the one who is jesting and doing it out of play. Nor is there a difference between the one who is jahil, the one who is ignorant, or the one who is an alim, the one who knows. Then he says, Hamidullah Ta'ala, to conclude, نسأل الله أن ينصر الإسلام والمسلمين ويذل أعداء الدين وصل اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. And with that, ya ikhwan, we will conclude today's lesson بإذن الله تعالى ونكتفي بهذا وصلي اللهم وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين وجزاكم الله خيرا.